Australia's media likes to complain that we're a major global exporter of gas while also experiencing a domestic gas shortage.
I think the West hasn't really fostered its supply chains like China has. And it's a mutually beneficial arrangement. So obviously Canada gets the income and America gets the energy security. So
But the Americans are about to go one better. Despite producing more oil than Saudi Arabia, our Mining Memo editor James Cooper points out that they may be at risk of their own oil shortage. This thanks to a lack of Canadian oil. James, it's all very confusing. How can this possibly happen?
yeah, thanks, Nick. So it's a bit of a strange situation here with Canada and the US oil. So as some listeners might be familiar with, America is a major, well, it is actually the world's largest producer of oil, surpassing Saudi Arabia, which probably would surprise a lot of people. So why isn't the US energy independent? And the reason for that is because it's invested heavily in refineries which process a type of oil called heavy sour. Um, Now, this is what the US used to produce a lot of sort of several decades ago, but these deposits have eventually depleted over time. So now, to keep these refineries operational, the country has spent a lot of money, a lot of capital into upgrading them. So it doesn't want to shelve them. So to keep these refineries operating, it relies on Canada's vast reserves of heavy crude, which it sometimes blends with its own light crude, which now comes from its prolific shale basins. Um, so it's not energy independent, even though it does produce a lot of this light crude oil production. It still relies on Canada for blending and for its to keep its refineries operational. So um, it's one of the reasons why America really does need the Canada oil trade, and for Canada, it needs that revenue, obviously, for sending exports to the US. So it's an interesting dilemma, and I think we could see some further fireworks between the US and Canada.
Is this what the whole Keystone Pipeline drama was all about? Trying to move that Canadian oil towards the American refineries?
I think so. Yeah. So it's all about keeping this sort of vast investment that America has put into its refineries over the years. So obviously, Canada can only fuel that with its pipelines. It's a natural.
It all reminds me of a story we've mentioned before in this video channel where some Irish defenders of a castle fighting the English discovered that their British-sized or English-sized musket balls didn't fit into their French-sized musket barrels. So they couldn't fire the bullets. So they started firing buttons instead. And there's some funny historical stories about soldiers sort of charging towards this castle and getting shot, but not even being injured and being completely mystified as to why. But it's a similar story, right? You've got the wrong oil for the refineries being produced, which makes things totally bizarre. It also, as you highlight in your Mining Memo article, points out the complexities of world trade, right? With the logistics, the supply chain issues. This overall complexity is creating risks for the trade war that historically didn't apply so much. So take us through that.
Yeah, so I think commodities really sit at the heart of what we talk about trade wars, and we've heard all the bluster from Trump in terms of um, he trying to take Canada as the 51st state, taking control of Greenland, signing a pact with Ukraine to get hold of its critical minerals. So it really sort of just puts commodities back into the center stage. I think the West um, hasn't really fostered its supply chains like China has, and I think it's really playing catch up quickly to try and restore these supply chains. And I think this is sort of the more bullish phase of the commodity cycle, which speaks to the sort of scarcity of certain suppliers and the geopolitics, which is sort of is threatening the supply of what were once stable commodities. So I think the US really needs to be careful. I think it is very reliant on a number of critical minerals, commodities, and back to the Canada example, I think 85% of potash fertilizer actually comes from Canada. So this is effectively feeding America. So this is another supply chain which is critical for the US and which it needs that Canadian partnership. So I
But
think,
on, like a lot of this time, a lot of the time, these issues are kind of understandable. What makes the oil one so interesting is, one barrel of oil is not like the other one, right? So there's like a hidden element to it that at least not completely obvious, where the oil must just not just be within the country; it must flow globally for the whole thing to work. Otherwise, you end up with the wrong oil in the wrong place. And I think that risk is what's interesting, right? Because the last time we experienced major trade wars, I don't think that complexity and lack of predictability applied in quite the same way. Our economy is now much more complex.
yeah, exactly. And not all oils are the same. So, and in terms of making that an investment opportunity, it is difficult. So, I mean, one opportunity, if you were kind of looking at international markets and going to the US, you could potentially look at one of the US producers who has a more leverage to heavy crude production within its borders, so it's not going to be impacted by tariffs. So that's maybe one avenue where you could sort of play into the geopolitical risk. Um, Obviously, it's uncertain still. I think Trump has given Canada a sort of 1 month armistice, so it's possible that we won't see any tariffs come through at
And I
all.
think that's the most interesting, apart from the investment angle. That's the most interesting part of your article is that it points out that Canada has a sort of trump card in all of this, right? That unless Canadian oil flows into the US, the refineries won't run, and that's not immediately obvious because America produces so much oil.
Mm. And it's a mutually beneficial arrangement. So obviously Canada gets the income and America gets the energy security. So it's in both of their interests to sort it out. But I think ultimately, when we talk about mineral scarcity and the rise of the commodity cycle, we're seeing the countries with the sort of secure supply are really holding the sort of ace card. So again, to the China, which has really spent uh, the last 15 years securing supply chains for copper, for cobalt, for graphite, for lithium across the globe, and then becoming a hub for processing all that, really gives an economic advantage. And I think this is one of the reasons why Trump has made metals and commodities such a major uh, political sort of motive in his first month in office. It speaks to the scarcity of commodities and the importance to secure supply chains for the US.
There's a totally bizarre situation that developed this week where I think it's the UK's climate change and energy minister Ed Miliband. He said he said that transitioning to renewables will mean that the UK is no longer reliant on foreign dictators for their fossil fuels. And of course, it's precisely the opposite. Fossil fuels are coming from the stable parts of the world, and it's the renewables sector that is dominated by a country led by a dictator in the Communist Party. So, anyway, the politics of all of this just makes a complete mess of it. It's not just oil, though, that the Americans are lacking at the moment. There's also a huge migration of gold from all parts of the world to America. What's going on?
Yeah, so America is, I think, what the latest was with. It's always hard to keep up with everything with Trump and um, the gold. So the country or the Trump administration wants to revalue its gold holdings, which haven't been revalued since the early 1970s. At the moment, the gold reserves in the US are valued at about $42 per ounce, and we now know that gold is almost $3,000 an ounce. I won't go into I don't understand all the mechanics of that, but I think again, I think gold is positioned here as a great opportunity, especially in Australia. I think I put out an article last week in Mining Memo, just speaking to the reserves that Australia holds. So Australia has the world's largest gold reserves, and I calculated. I did some back of the napkin sort of serviette Australia calculations for total gold reserves. So this is unmined reserves in Australia, and it actually would pay off our national debt if you accounted for a sort of $1,200 per ounce all-in sustaining cost. So we've got some sort of vast untapped potential to realise our own gold reserves here in Australia. Obviously, it's not sitting in a bank or sitting in a vault in Fort Knox. It's sitting in the ground in Western Australia and a few other states. It will take capital and resources to pull that out of the ground. But I think as gold sort of hits the mainstream, I think it's presents a great opportunity for a lot of Australian gold miners, which may not be hitting production yet, but they're sitting on part of these vast reserves that are within Australia. So that's what one of our focuses with my service at Diggers and Drillers. We've looked at companies which have been sitting on these gold projects, but thanks to sort of changing technologies and higher gold prices, these deposits are becoming more economic to mine. So there's still deep value in these stocks, unlike say bullion or some of the big producers, which have already sort of trading at record highs. A lot of these gold juniors, which have big reserves, which are economic to mine, are still trading at very low valuations. So I think this is probably the best place to be in if you're kind of looking for the next sort of phase of the gold bull market.
You have a presentation out that takes viewers through how technology is going to make what used to be uneconomic deposits economic, at least certain ones, and you identify which stocks are poised to take advantage of that, best poised, I should say. So if people want to check out that presentation from you, there should be a link in the description or at the top of the comments section. And don't forget to check out James's Mining Memo about the Canadian American oil story and the trump card that Canada has over America's oil supply. James, thanks for joining us, and to everyone at home, thanks for watching.
Thanks, Steve.